Record shops were great to spend time in. I could spend 3 or 4 hours just strolling round.
That was one of the most exciting places to hang out.
You break the veneer of the hip joint employee. And all it is a kind of like, all right, you know, just one of them, and you're like, I own this town and everything in it. You know, that's how it felt.
When people walked around town, you know, if you had some albums under your arm, told people who you were.
Something to read on the bus on the way home from the record shop.
Really a magical moment, you know, you'd rush home and you'd put the music on.
You'd have to extract the record, you know, from its sleeve and, you know, place it on the turntable.
And the first time you drop a needle on a record, it's 10 points if there's a little bit of skid, and then
bump, and then biting into it as the needle hit the vinyl.
And then the music comes in. There's nothing as wonderful as that.
The unsung hero in popular music's epic history is not a performer, or a band, or even a song. It's this, the long-playing album. A creative canvas on which musicians could express themselves like never before. It turned record labels into business empires. Turned humble musicians into exalted immortals, and helped transform popular music from disposable teenage distraction to an art form. This is the story of how, from the mid-60s to the late 70s, the long-playing album changed popular music forever. The era when albums ruled the world. Around 130 grams of vinyl and acetate mix, 1,600 feet of groove, 33 1/3 revolutions per minute. The long-playing vinyl record was unveiled to the world by Columbia Records in 1948. With up to 22.5 minutes of sound per side, it was the perfect vehicle for classical music and soundtracks to popular musicals. It was a product aimed at and bought by adults.
I remember a lot of soundtrack albums, you know, if your parents went to see a show or a film, then they'd get West Side Story soundtrack or Oklahoma soundtrack or My Fair Lady. And it was very much, I saw LPs as being part of the grown-up world.
Along with soundtracks and classical music, the LP soon became home to easy listening collections and jazz recordings. But while parents listened to their LPs, teenagers were dancing to a different beat. This was rock and roll, preserve of a smaller, cheaper disc.
At 45 is just a little guy with a big fat hole in the middle, slips onto this penis. How very phallic, how very sexual.
But as the 50s became the 60s, teenagers' disposable income grew, and rock and roll, increasingly called pop music, began to creep onto the grooves of the LP.
Many albums of that era, you know, by pop artists, you know, contain, you know, the singles and then, you know, some duff tracks, a few covers, and some filler. The artistic pinnacle, you know, is a hit single as a pop artist, and an album in a way is often seen or very much almost as a kind of cash-in on the single rather than the other way round.
The artistic opportunity the LP could provide was still waiting to be discovered.
Intellectually, it was fallow. The minds of the young people hadn't really expanded yet.
I'm all shook up.
But change was in the air. In New York's Greenwich Village, folk music was about to show that the LP could be the canvas for a new kind of musical expression. In the early 1960s, American folk music was enjoying a renaissance. Folk captured the spirit of protest in a society still scarred by racial segregation.
Society itself is changing during the early 60s, both technologically and socially. And there's a growing sense that music itself should address some of that.
I've seen trouble all my days.
Into this scene stepped a 20-year-old Bob Dylan. His 1962 debut was a collection of folk standards. But for his second record, he did something different.
Oh, where have you been, my blue-eyed son?
He recorded an album almost entirely made up of original songs.
My darling young one.
That marks a change, and one that's quite noticeable among his peers and general public, that the songs are credited to Bob Dylan. He is the artist behind this album.
Here were 13 songs that tackled love, war, peace and race.
I ran into him at a party, and he was in a back bedroom playing to some girls, trying to impress some girls, and he played Masters of War and Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, and I was like, what? This is the most powerful thing I'd ever heard.
Come, you masters of war. You that build the big guns.
Freewheeling was Dylan's statement on the world around him.
Bob Dylan was clearly developing the idea of looking at the album as a collection. There was serious thought put into the makeup of what this album was going to be.
Sun don't shine above the ground.
This was a landmark. This was a new chapter in American music.
The answer, my friend, is a blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
Everything about Freewheeling seemed to herald a new era, right down to the cover.
Nobody did covers like that then. It was so confident, so oblique, so casual. Like, yeah, I got a girlfriend, so what? Here she is. It's not glamorous, it's nothing, it's just reality. The whole thing, just powerful.
Well, before I start singing, and it's a hard.
The expansive canvas of the long player had allowed Bob Dylan to find his voice. In return, Dylan had given the album a new purpose. While the early albums from British bands like the Rolling Stones, the Beatles and the Kinks were still just collections of pop songs, Dylan's next records would continue to push the boundaries of what an album could be.
He pushes that further and further by, introducing 11-minute songs on Highway 61 Revisited, on Desolation Row, and then having, what is one of the very first double albums with Blonde on Blonde, where you have, side-sprawling tracks.
And with these albums now charting in the US top 10, Dylan's vision for the album was entering the mainstream.
Dylan's career, in a way, provides a blueprint for how artists that follow him want to pursue their careers. They want to be able to pursue their own artistic vision, and they want to pursue it on album.
In California, this artistic vision was heightened by the addition of a new ingredient.
Diethylamide, popularly known as LSD. If you haven't heard of LSD, you will.
LSD was the catalyst behind a psychedelic subculture that had the album at its core.
The whole kind of chunk of your mind gets opened up, and a lot of the musicians had fairly good experiences with acid.
By 1966, the folk music revival had reached California, where bands like Jefferson Airplane had absorbed it into a new musical melting pot.
Jack and Yorma were bluesmen. Paul liked outer space, and Marty wrote love songs. And I liked folk music. So you got a real smorgasbord of stuff, and I liked it that way.
But it was the acid that took the music of the West Coast underground in entirely new directions.
You can hear it in the music. The growth of Indian scales, rag-type scales, and feedback sounds, and There's a certain texture of recording which you say, well, I think those people probably took acid at some point or another.
LA band The Doors were perhaps the ultimate exponents of this acid-laced psychedelic rock.
We said, we're going to make some music that's going to blow their minds. Yes, sir. Break On Through to the Other Side is an LSD song. People think it's about death. Oh, you're going to break on through to death. Is that a death-obsessed song, Ray? I said, no, it's got nothing to do with death. It's got to do with breaking out of the confines of your three-dimensional body. The day destroys the night, night divides the day. We tried to run, we tried to hide. We'll break on through to the other side.
Break on through to the other side. Break on through to the other side. Break on.
For a band like The Doors, the 3-minute pop song was no longer enough to contain their artistic ambition.
This is the end, beautiful friend.
Dig this, man. The end is 11 and a half minutes long. You can put that on an LP. There's no more 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes, or you don't have to have 3.5-minute little songs.
Birds to set you free.
Couldn't have done it without the LP. We exist because the long-playing record existed.
The Doors' self-titled debut album hit the US #2 spot in early 1967. Expansive psychedelic rock LPs like this were tailor-made for their tune-in, drop-out audience.
I mean, one reason why album culture suited psychedelic culture is that if you were sprawled out or sitting cross-legged and being semi-meditative to the music, the last thing you wanted was to have to get up and, you know, turn the record over or change the record any more often than you had to.
Call your friends and come on over and everybody sit and listen to the whole album all at once. You make comments about it afterwards, smoke a bunch of dope or have wine or whatever you do. And it was great.
But while this new audience devoured the records of the psychedelic scene, one place this new album-based music couldn't be heard was radio.
I need
The big American radio stations, I mean the giants, you know, in LA, 93 KHJ, for example, the Boss Jocks, they were playing singles. So, you know, there wasn't a lot of platform on air for album music until the arrival of KSAN in San Francisco.
KSAN was a local station that revolutionized American radio. In 1967, a KSAN DJ connected to the psychedelic scene called Tom Donahue stopped broadcasting chart hits and started playing album tracks instead.
This is Tom Donahue at KSAN, KSA and Metro Media Stereo 95, San Francisco, Oakland.
This new format was an instant success.
By the late 60s, every town in America had an FM station with at least a late-night free-form show, if not all day long.
It was a massive game changer. The origination of the engine, the first part of the engine that powered album sales in America through the 70s.
Donahue's radio revolution soon crossed the Atlantic and found its way aboard the pirate radio stations based off the coast of Britain.
The turning point for me was hearing John Peel do Perfume Garden late at night, out there, and as John described it one night, in his stone solitude in the middle of the North Sea, playing this amazing music that he'd brought back from America with him.
The concept of the album as a revolutionary musical force was spreading. And in London, it would now emerge as the object and the idea that would dominate the next decade of music history. By the mid-60s, swinging London had become the hippest city in the world. Acts like The Who, Dusty Springfield and Manfred Mann had scored hit single after international hit single. But the biggest singles band of them all, the Beatles, have been absorbing American album music from Dylan to the psychedelic scene.
It's start of the 60s, your parents loved them. And you know, your mum would take you to see Help or Hard Day's Night, and maybe she'd buy the LP for herself. And by the end of the 60s, your parents despised the Beatles. And they were symbolic of everything that they were afraid was going to happen to you, that you were going to grow your hair, that you were going to take drugs.
When I saw that Rubber Soul album cover and they're all looking down, you looked at them and went, uh-oh, these guys have been psychedelicized.
After the Beatles ended their 1966 world tour, they returned to London's Abbey Road studios to begin another recording session. But this time, things would be different.
Out of the blue, John says to George Martin, you know, on this record, we're going to create sounds that, you know, no one's ever heard before. We don't have to worry about reproducing them live because we're never going to tour again.
At the end of 1966, the Beatles started work on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and so began the most ambitious album recording session to date.
When you see shots of George Harrison bundling out of a Rolls Royce and in through the door of Abbey Road with reams and reams of A4, waving at everyone, head down, getting into the studio, getting to work. It's like they must have felt like they were splitting the atom in there.
For those inside Abbey Road, it was clear the band wanted this to be a different kind of recording session.
John especially was looking for something new, but the things weren't in the studio to create things new, so that was the sort of gauntlet that was thrown down.
Analog 4-track studio technology was to be pushed to its limit.
Every time we were going to use an instrument, they were fed up with listening to a guitar sounding like a guitar, or a piano sounding like a piano, you know, cowbell sounding like a cowbell. So we did all we could to try and mask those sounds, although, you know, you knew it was a guitar, but it had some sort of quirkiness to it, you know.
This intensive approach to recording was another influence picked up from the American psychedelic scene.
The idea that it's possible to, you know, really spend time in the studio and experiment and explore. Brian Wilson was doing that with Pet Sounds, and Paul sort of picked that baton up as well.
All right, here we go then. We'll send the tape. Are you ready, Richard? Just come.
Marshalling the band was veteran producer George Martin.
Okay, Jeff. Yep. All right, here we go.
Who turned the studio into the LP's final instrument.
George was brilliant at that. He was like a schoolmaster and we were school children, you know.
The last tracks on the record were laid down in April 1967.
That night set up a monitor mix and there was just the most unbelievable atmosphere.
Woke up, fell out of bed, dragged a comb across my head.
No one had ever heard anything that sounded like that in their lives. It was like going from a square black and white picture into CinemaScope Technicolor. And Ron Richards was sitting on the floor by the mixing console, and Ron was the producer of the Hollies, and Ron had his head in his hands, and he said, I'm going to give the business up. That was his intention. It was that amazing.
What the Beatles had created was arguably the world's first concept album. Since they weren't touring anymore, the Beatles would go on the road in their imaginations as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
This is the start of his concept. It was like some fictitious band and they were tuning up at the Albert Hall.
They're creating a kind of quasi-live set and bring in a lot of ideas that are quintessentially English, you have to say. You know, the sort of musical idea of it, a brass band.
And then you hear laughter. The reason why the laughter's there is that we're supposed to be the audience. The listener of that album is supposed to be sitting in the audience of a theatre.
And the way that they flow into each other. The way that the stories and the themes reappear.
There's a cohesive thread that binds all these songs together. The album has a beginning, a middle, and an end. This was a revelation.
The concept of an imaginary band on tour was played out on the album sleeve as well.
Bela Lugosi and God knows who, Lenny Bruce, W.C. Fields, Laurel and Hardy.
Oh, look, there's Marlon Brando. Oh, there's Bob Dylan. This is might be the most recognisable album cover of all time.
As a last innovative touch, the final groove on the record was cut back on itself, so in theory it would play into infinity. Just like the influence of the music itself.
Sgt. Pepper is the template for everything we come to know now as the great long-playing record.
Sgt. Pepper's shot to #1 in the UK and became the longest and highest charting of all the Beatles albums in America. By the end of the year, sales of albums in the US passed the $1 billion mark for the first time. Albums were now outselling singles in both the US and the UK.
Sgt. Pepper, it was a catalyst. When you think 66, 67 was an incredibly creative time. So, you know, you've got other bands that were coming through, particularly in London, the Underground, bands like Pink Floyd, Soft Machine, who weren't conforming their songs to 2.5, 3 minute single formats.
Some bands tried to copy the Sgt. Pepper's formula. Some lampooned it. Others, like guitarist Jimi Hendrix, wanted to take the idea of artistic control a step further. Hendrix had been plucked from obscurity by producer Chas Chandler in 1966. Together they made 2 albums that established Hendrix as the most influential guitarist in rock. But his 1968 LP Electric Ladyland would be a new departure. After a fallout with Chandler, this would be Hendrix's first album without a producer. Artistic control over album recording was entering a new phase.
So Hendrix at this point, in order to kind of warm up almost, is every single evening going to jam at a club 2 blocks down the street called The Scene. He would literally turn up and jam with whoever happened to be on stage.
You know, we have the session booked for 8 o'clock, and no Jimmy.
And then around midnight or so, when Jimmy felt he'd got enough players that he felt were in the moment with him and would be useful in the studio, he would literally walk from the Scene down to the record plant like a circus of people walking these 2 blocks in New York.
I can think of this one fabulous night where he dragged in Steve Winwood, Jack Cassidy. They come in, Mitch gets on the drums, Jimmy plugs in the guitar, the organ's all ready, the bass, everything. We open up the faders, they rehearse 1 take, next take, that's the master. Done. We get Voodoo Child.
This is where we are now with long-playing records. We're beyond even where the Beatles were, who were more or less 9 to 5 creatures in the studio. We're, when will the lightning strike? We need to be ready.
Complete control of the recording process allowed Hendrix to indulge his every musical whim.
Electric Ladyland it was his most adventurous record, and there was so much, so many great things he was doing in the studio that hadn't necessarily been heard before.
The result was tracks of increasing length and complexity, such as the near 14-minute 1983.
Hooray, I awake from yesterday. 1 take all the way through.
Which Hendrix even helped mix.
I would take 1 half of the console and I'd give Jimmy like a vocal track and some other things over here, and we would rehearse it as a performance. And then in the middle of the mix, we would look at each other and we would start laughing and say, okay, you ready to split? Okay, go. And I'd get up and I'd shift positions with Jimmy, and Jimmy would take my position and we'd go like this, you ready to go back? Yep. And then we'd bump into each other. He would fall on the floor laughing, I'd fall on the floor laughing, and then the tape would still be running.
Electric Ladyland was the first Hendrix LP to hit the top of the US charts when released in 1968, proving that artistic freedom could equal commercial success.
classic double albums like Electric Ladyland were met with a certain amount of incomprehension by early reviewers. They weren't designed to whack you over the head the first time you heard them and give up all they had to offer on that first hearing. You know, they were designed to gradually sink in, to reveal more detail and subtext as you listen to them over and over again.
Increasingly adventurous album tracks from both British and American bands were now dominating the ever more popular FM radio network in America. This album music was becoming a category all of its own, AOR, album-oriented rock.
You know, you've got bands who are now maturing and now delivering what was becoming increasingly sophisticated music. Fantastic sort of time for albums to burst through, supported by American radio in the way that they were.
You got the Velvet Underground, you had Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, you had Captain Beefheart. You had a whole bunch of stuff that would have been, that wouldn't even have been classified as pop music or rock music just a little while earlier.
Ever since I was a young boy, I played the silver ball.
In London, The Who, once known as a singles band, released a double album called Tommy. Its writer, Pete Townshend, proclaimed it a rock opera.
It's such a cliche term now, but at the time it was exciting and fresh. A rock opera, you know, grandeur, meaning, credibility.
And The Who weren't the only chart-friendly band to recognise the creative power of the album.
Some people may see the Stones as perhaps more of a singles band. They think of Satisfaction, Paint It Black, and of course that's what they were to begin with, in the same way that that's what the Beatles were to begin with. But they wouldn't have the legacy they have now if they hadn't made the same journey the Beatles did, from being this supernova singles act into a long-playing oriented band that made its reputation completely on its albums.
Starting in 1968, the Stones made a series of 4 albums which would be seen by many as their creative peak.
If you think of some of their greatest tracks, Sympathy for the Devil, You Can't Always Get What You Want, Wild Horses, none of these are singles.
The more rock bands embraced the LP and pushed its artistic boundaries, the more sales soared. By 1969, some 200 million albums were being bought annually in the US. And rock LPs accounted for 4/5 of these sales. The economics of the industry were changing. Commercial success no longer depended on hit singles, as one band was about to prove. With a harder-edged, raucous rock sound, Led Zeppelin hit the top of the US and UK charts with their 1969 debut album. The band was led by a veteran session guitarist.
We're talking about a guy, Jimmy Page, who'd played on something like 60% of every hit single made in London over the previous 5 years.
Led Zeppelin were Page's way out from a career of playing on other people's hit singles.
The whole idea is for Jimmy Page to do everything he'd never done before. Not make music to the clock, not make hits.
When work finished on the band's second album later in 1969, Page sent Zeppelin's manager Peter Grant with an ultimatum to Atlantic Records. No singles were to be released, not even the surefire hit Whole Lotta Love.
Peter, in his air of threat about him, he said, no singles. And everybody looked in astonishment.
The record company, understandably, utterly baffled. Here's this hit in the making, we can't release it.
But Carson wasn't about to be told what to do, even by Peter Grant and Led Zeppelin.
I decided that there should be a single, right? I did that, and I put a single out. I put an edited version of a Whole Lotta Love out and incurred the total wrath of Jimmy Page and Peter Grant. and was immediately forced to withdraw the whole damn lot. I think the number was something like 3,000 went to Manchester before I could stop them going there.
Even with no singles to promote it, Led Zeppelin II topped the charts in both America and Britain in 1970.
Jimmy and Peter Grant and Led Zeppelin were right. By not having a single, that Led Zeppelin II album was selling like it was a single.
Within 3 years, Led Zeppelin were the biggest grossing act in the world.
That is probably the pinnacle of how to sell an album. Make great music and make it available only in its album format. Don't sell anybody a single.
The single was rapidly falling out of fashion. By the turn of the decade, albums accounted for over 80% of record sales. But while the rock album was on the crest of a wave, other musical forms were suffering. The popularity of jazz had been declining for years. Not even one of the most celebrated jazz musicians of all time was immune. Miles Davis, a long-time Columbia Records artist.
You know, he came to me, didn't miss words. He says, these fucking young, long-haired white kids, they're stealing my rip. He said, how come I'm selling 70,000 and they're selling 1 million, 2 million albums?
With Columbia riding high on sales of rock LPs, Clive Davis knew better than anyone where the album buying market was. Rock fans.
Of my saying, Miles, you know, you're playing in small jazz clubs. I said, you've got to get out where the young people are. You're going to be impressed with what you hear. Somehow it's going to influence your music. And moreover, you're going to have an audience that just doesn't go to your jazz clubs.
So for his next project, Miles Davis took a whole new approach to the jazz LP.
At this particular moment, you suddenly get Miles Davis dropping the suit and tie, dropping the super jazz cool, suddenly dressing like Jimi Hendrix. Big shades, robes, and suddenly he makes this extraordinary album called Bitches Brew.
The double album Bitches Brew was released in 1970 with a cover from artist Marty Klarwein, whose work had adorned Jimi Hendrix LPs. The music was a radical departure for jazz, adding rock guitar and drums. It was a style that became known as fusion.
So, what you will find in fusion that you can listen to, that you'll pull out of it, is the groove. A jazz personality on top of a rock groove, fundamentally, and that's what fusion fundamentally is.
It was interesting because during those days, jazz and rock started to work together, and all of a sudden, you heard jazz being played on a technical level that was next level. It's like, whoa.
To record the album, Davis had assembled an astonishing array of young jazz talent, including drummer Billy Cobham. The tracks were heavily improvised, with Davis as the conductor.
He said to me the night before, you know, that groove that we played, I like that, play it tomorrow. Okay, got there, of course I couldn't remember what to play. And I started to play something, he says, that's not what you played last night, but I like that, I want to play.
Bitches Brew changed everything for Davis. Hardcore jazz fans were outraged by this new direction. But Davis was now playing to rock fans at the Isle of Wight Festival in 1970.
Is this a jazz festival? No. Is this a pop festival? Absolutely not. This is a rock, long playing, freak out, far out, join in, trip out, go on your journey festival.
Davis tapped into this vast rock audience, scoring his first gold record, on one of the best-selling jazz albums ever. The musicians from Bitches Brew would go on to form bands like Mahavishnu Orchestra, Weather Report and Return to Forever, whose LPs would cement fusion as jazz's dominant direction for the 1970s. But even with sales soaring, not everyone had yet woken up to the power of the album. In Detroit, Tamla Motown was the most successful record label of the 1960s, an empire built on the 45.
The core of the Detroit sound was the idea of the 2.5-minute single that was instantly recognisable, that had a chorus, 3 verses, and a song that was effervescent, upbeat, very positive about life. They were not essentially, at least in the 60s, an album company.
As the 70s dawned, Motown owner Berry Gordy remained committed to the label's hit factory formula.
He imagined that he had a better sense of what made a hit record than any members of his staff. This often led to a kind of rancorous relationship with the producers and sometimes with the singers and musicians.
One of these singers was about to launch Motown into the album era. Marvin Gaye was known as the Prince of Motown, the epitome of the label's chart-friendly sound. But his relationship with his label was becoming fraught.
He felt that the company was essentially constraining him in all sorts of different ways. He always felt that Berry Gordy was denying him being the full Marvin Gaye.
You know, this is a guy who really didn't want the restrictions of Motown on him. It was a hit factory, and all of a sudden these artists wanted to grow.
Following the death of singing partner Tammy Terrell, Gaye had become disillusioned with his pop career and increasingly concerned with Detroit's social problems.
Gradually, from about 1967 onwards, that was the year of the urban riots in Detroit, he began to compile almost a kind of dossier of different things that were going on in the city, and that dossier became the basis of probably the greatest soul concept album of all time, Marvin Gaye's What's Going On.
This is it. This is What's Going On, Marvin Gaye. Best sleeve, don't you think?
In 1970, under Berry Gordy's radar, Gaye had begun work on some new material. Not hit singles, but an album, and a radical new direction for Motown.
You knew when you heard it that it was important, and this was a move on, not just in terms of what he was saying, i.e. what's going on, it was more the construction of the whole piece.
The tracks on What's Going On seemed to melt into one another. A theme of social commentary and snippets of conversation gave the album a documentary feel. This was a concept album in the new rock mold.
It was probably like the early days of rock and roll where bands like the Stones and the Beatles were basically emulating their blues gospel idols from America. But here the roles were reversed. For the first time, the black acts were starting to imitate the rock act.
Musically, Gaye brought nearly a decade of songwriting experience to bear.
You know, everything there, jazz, funk, soul, it was all there.
Berry Gordy was worried Gaye's new direction would alienate his core audience. But released in May 1971, What's Going On became Marvin Gaye's first LP to break the Billboard Top 10.
This album came out like a smooth assassin. It was like, it crept up on you, you know, it's screaming, it should be a rock album. Its statements are so strong, you know, but yet it's delivered so coolly and so smoothly.
The fact that he gets to the end of that and he goes up on that high note, and then it comes back in like the record begins, and the fact that it doesn't resolve, it just trots off into the distance. almost suggested that music is playing still somewhere in the universe.
Within a year, it had sold 2 million copies and become Motown's biggest selling LP. Even Motown had now entered the album game.
It was with what's going on that they began to realise that there was a market in the album, and then that subsequently set the tone for big albums by Diana Ross, Stevie Wonder's 3 albums in the 70s.
It's this moment where rock and the whole idea of the long-playing record actually now infiltrates every sphere of music.
The early 70s saw musicians from all backgrounds embracing the approach and commercial potential of the rock album. Bands like Jethro Tull fuse rock with English folk. The Doobie Brothers mix rock with country. And in the glam rock scene, the power of the album divided 2 of the biggest artists, Marc Bolan and David Bowie.
The crucial difference really between what T-Rex and Marc Bolan were doing and what David Bowie and the Spiders from Mars were doing can be summed up in 2 words: long player.
Bolan was a glam rock pioneer, but it was the single, not the album, that was his focus.
I think Marc Bolan and David Bowie, they always had different goals. Marc Bolan wanted to have singles. He wanted to emulate the singles that he grew up with by Little Richard, Elvis Presley. David made great albums, and let the single be damned. He did get great singles out of the albums, but it wasn't his purpose. It wasn't his primary purpose.
Bowie used LPs to stretch himself as an artist.
I hadn't seen him for a whole year and a half, and he came to my apartment in full Ziggy regalia. No eyebrows, spiky orange hair and all that. But when this voice came out of that person, it was my friend David.
Now Ziggy play guitar, jamming good with weird and Spiders from Mars.
He was the first rock star to invent a rock star, to invent a person with another name. You know, that's unbelievable. And then he could still be, the album could be Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars.
Ziggy really sang.
So, you know, Bolan was the pathfinder in a way when it comes to glam rock. But it was David Bowie, it was Roxy Music. Those were the artists that really benefited long term because they were LP artists.
As well as allowing artists the space to grow creatively, the album also allowed them to look inward and explore a more personal agenda. In the early 70s, a new kind of musician started to adopt the album, the singer-songwriter.
Suddenly it was like people kind of sat down and were contemplating people more and were wanting to know more what they had to say and what they had to say about the world, as it were. Therefore it became more introspective.
Tonight you're mine completely.
Carole King had spent the 1960s writing hits for other people.
A lot of what we did in the early days, creating a really good track and getting a couple of good-looking kids and putting them on it, that was a different business.
But stardom in the era of the album depended on a different set of qualities.
You got to get up every morning with a smile on your face and show the world.
In 1970, King and producer Lou Adler of Ode Records began work on a collection of songs with the working title Tapestry.
I certainly knew, and Carole knew, that we were making an album. It was obvious that we were trying to complete something and not just go for a hit single or something. It was way past that.
So far away, doesn't anybody stay in one place anymore?
Tapestry would be the most personal and intimate work of King's career.
In the older sessions, you went in, whatever the lights were, that's what you recorded under. In these kind of sessions, if you're doing a ballad, you turn the lights down a little bit.
Long ago. I reached for you and
when I describe what Tapestry means to me, I always describe it as it's the musical equivalent of your big sister or your big brother putting the kettle on when you're having a really bad time and they're like, come over here, come on, we'll sort it out, we'll have a cup of tea, we'll fix the world.
stayed in bed all morning just to pass the time.
There's something wrong here, there can be no denying. One of us is changing, or maybe we just start trying.
The final running order of Tapestry was a masterclass in one of the secrets of a great album: sequencing.
I must have spent 2 weeks or more on the sequence of Tapestry. Coming out of the right chord into the right chord of the next song so that you don't, abruptly shake somebody. Not only shake them, but musically shake them.
The transition from So Far Away to It's Too Late was a classic example of Adler's sequence.
What I really like is you're going from this chord, it's a fade out actually, so we don't get a proper ending on So Far Away, but it sets you up nicely for that move to the A minor 7 there. Because that chord's there again. So there's this really nice harmonic relationship. They're in different keys, but they're echoing the song that's come before.
Looking out.
Tapestry was released in the US in March 1971.
All that kind of pop thing that she had come from, she poured into this album, but it's very personalised too. And that's quite a potent combination.
The album spent 15 consecutive weeks at the top of the US album charts, the only time a female solo artist would achieve this in the entire 20th century. No solo album would outsell it until Thriller, over a decade later. Tapestry was confirmation that the era of the album encouraged a new kind of star.
Carol and I won 5 Grammys that year, the most by a female artist at that time. We won Best Album of the Year and Song of the Year and Single of the Year. So that, it validated Carole King as an artist.
Artists like James Taylor, Joni Mitchell and Don McLean contributed to the singer-songwriter boom. Britain's answer was Elton John, who scored 7 consecutive #1 LPs in the US in the early 70s. Only the Beatles ever surpassed this feat. But in contrast to the intimate, stripped-back style of the singer-songwriters, other musicians were using the LP to create ever more elaborate musical landscapes. This was progressive rock.
In a strange way, we were musical scientists. We had lots of ingredients of different instruments around us, and we had lots of different kinds of musical knowledge. And I didn't want to play 3 chords and just sort of do blues solos and things. I wanted to go to different levels and fuse music and put things together.
The most popular album band on the Billboard charts for 1972 was a prog band, Yes.
Yes, music was convoluted as it was excellent.
Songs often spanned entire sides of vinyl. Double albums became triple albums. Such grandiose music required similarly creative sleeve design. Yes found their visual identity through artist Roger Dean.
I never tried to paint music. What I was looking for in the imagery was something that would stop people, make them think, and have something that was from the same source as the music, rather than an image of the music.
That was desperately important to us, desperately important, because the cover was as important as to what was inside. I mean, they say you tell a book by its cover, you can also tell a vinyl by its cover.
Increasingly extravagant packaging allowed Dean to explore entire narratives through a single album design.
When we did the Yes Songs album, it was a great opportunity to tell the story because it was a triple album with a booklet. Landing on a new planet, life restarting, and humans and cities coming about.
Yes's huge album sales gave Dean's artwork huge exposure.
We did sell an enormous number of posters and calendars and books. I've looked at figures ranging from 60 to 100 million, so it's a lot of pieces.
But iconic sleeves and progressive sounds didn't only meet in the world of rock. The albums of the Parliament Funkadelic Collective created a funk universe, every bit as creative as prog.
It was the most insane, ridiculous, creative, ludicrous band collective of all time, Parliament Funkadelic. Just the most genius insanity that music has ever produced.
Bands like Parliament Funkadelic, they were much more like the R&B, soul, funk versions of like the Grateful Dead.
Band leader George Clinton's clash of psychedelic rock, soul and funk met its match with the album artwork of Pedro Bell.
It's Afrocentric, it's mad, it's kind of got satanic qualities to it, it's challenging all sorts of different things. I mean, just look at the breasts of this weird-looking woman here. One's a map of the world, the other's a musical turntable in the end of her nipples.
I think it's just very hard not to like a record which, on the sleeve, it describes the record company as vinyl bin banglers, and where the bass musicians are called bass thumpasaurians.
Cosmic slop, no compute, trash a go-go, march to the witch's castle, the nappy dugout, and two skeletons having sex in the corner. Excellent.
For the 70s music fan, the album sleeve became a symbol of their identity.
It actually summed up a lifestyle. You know, when people walked around town, you know, if you had some albums under your arm, it told people who you were. If you walked into somebody's house and there was racks and racks and racks of album covers, you know, and it's a bit like going into somebody's library and you look to see what books they read to kind of ascertain what kind of person they are. Well, the same thing happened with the album cover.
Of all the iconic images on 70s album sleeves, one above all appeared to define the era. Pink Floyd's 1973 album, The Dark Side of the Moon. One of the highest selling albums in history.
When I was growing up as a child in the kind of late 70s and early 80s, it was a commonly held belief that there was a factory somewhere in Germany which only pressed copies of Dark Side of the Moon. It just seemed convincingly true because practically every household, or certainly every parent's household, had a copy of Dark Side of the Moon. You could not avoid that record.
The Dark Side of the Moon would sell some 40 million copies in its lifetime. Yet it was released with a stark sleeve design with no mention or photo of the band. The cover art was the brainchild of the Hipgnosis design agency.
Hipgnosis never worked for record companies. We only worked for the artists. We were commissioned directly to work for all the people that we worked for. The record companies hated us with a vengeance.
When Storm and Poe from Hipgnosis went into EMI with a cover, and the EMI went, a record cover with no picture and no name, and you know, can't have that. And they went, tell you what, we can. Because we're with Pink Floyd. That's what they want, that's what they're having, and that's what you're doing.
At no point when you're flicking through the racks in a record shop, unless you knew what that was, you would not know that's Pink Floyd.
The themes on Dark Side were uncompromisingly adult.
The idea was that
the album would sort of focus on the pressures that we were feeling, I suppose, or the sort of things that impinge on your life. Money, sort of acquisition of too much in a way, and mortality, time, rather than teenage love, which we felt perhaps other people did better.
The band's attitude to publicity was similarly uncommercial.
They didn't do one press interview. Not one press interview. There wasn't even a picture. Because why would you bring a picture of someone you haven't interviewed? You know, I mean, and you weren't going to reproduce a picture of their covers. Because they weren't on the cover. So, you know, but it didn't do them any harm. It was just extraordinary that they got away with it in a way.
I think at the time we were being a bit grand and felt that we didn't really want to be too involved in the sort of promotion that the record company were doing. I think there was a playback at the Planetarium, and I think we decided that we weren't going to turn up for this. Quite why, I've no idea.
Despite Pink Floyd's disdain for publicity, Dark Side of the Moon spent 14 years in the Billboard Top 200. No other album has ever come close to this feat.
This piece of work, I think they'll still be listening to in the same way they listened to Mozart, you know, in hundreds of years' time. It's just perfect. There are no rough edges.
You're going to ask me why I think Dark Side was successful. And my answer is that it's more than one reason. It isn't just because the drums are so fantastic or anything like that. It's actually the fact the lyrics are extraordinary in that they're more relevant to a 50-year-old than they are to a 23-year-old in many ways.
Dark Side turned Pink Floyd into one of the biggest bands in the world. But an album was now capable of even more than that.
I'll see you on the dark side of the moon.
In 1973, the first release from a startup independent label called Virgin Records was delivered to be cut to vinyl. Each side was a single experimental instrumental track. It was written and performed by a complete unknown. It featured no lyrics and no songs.
And it's always every young musician's dream to make their own album. It's, you know, what life is about. They thought one day I'll make my own album.
In 1973, young musician Mike Oldfield sent a set of home demos to every record company in London. No one was interested. But then they came to the attention of an independent record shop owner.
Somebody brought a tape that he'd made, which was the sort of the makings of Tubular Bells that he'd recorded in his flat above his mother's house, and it was captivating.
Branson saw something in Oldfield's tapes that the record companies didn't. When he launched his own record company a few months later, Oldfield was the first person he called.
They said, okay, we'll give you a week in the studio, and in that week I did a huge part of Tubular Bells, nearly all of it.
Oldfield played almost every instrument on the record and composed all the music.
It would, be a long, difficult job and take me, quite some time. The studio was a big thing, cost hundreds of pounds, or hundreds of dollars per hour. So to be allowed free reign of a studio was quite a special thing.
The album was released in May 1973. Richard Branson arranged a live television recital to promote it, but Oldfield was less keen.
I finished the album and I was pretty exhausted, and then they came to me and said, all right, now you've got to do all that again, but live.
Oldfield's mesmerising instrumental had been meticulously constructed in the studio. He hadn't considered the complications of performing it live.
Oh, I think we counted it once. over 18 or 1900 overdubs on tubular bells. And I had to work out how to translate that studio production into a live concert, and it was exhausting.
On the way there, he said to me, I'm afraid I just can't do it. You know, I just can't face it. I'd got a very old Bentley, which cost about £300, which my parents had given me for a wedding present. And I was driving him there in it. And I pulled in and I said to Mike, look, you know, if you can overcome your psychological problems, the keys are yours. And Mike sort of sat there for about 5 seconds and said, I think I'm feeling slightly better. That night he performed at the Queen Elizabeth Hall and brought the house down. It was absolutely, breathtaking. I mean, standing ovation for I don't know, 20 minutes at the end.
The audience absolutely loved it, which is a rapturous reception. Rather nice. And I got the Bentley.
Tubular Bells has sold 18 million copies worldwide and spent nearly 300 weeks in the charts. It was the album upon which Richard Branson built his empire.
Obviously, Tubular Bells, made an enormous difference, and it really kicked off our record company.
By the end of 1974, in America, more money was being spent on records than movies or sports. And the major record labels were joining the ranks of the corporate elite.
By the early 70s, most of the record companies have interests in lots of areas. RCA, home for David Bowie during the 1970s, and a fantastic stream of albums he produced, also owns the Hertz rental car company. MCA has Universal Studios, and with companies themselves thinking big, you get equally the promotion of artists who are kind of mega stars during this period. People like Elton John, for instance, Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy, selling something like 1.3 million copies within its first 4 days of sales. So, huge budgets are then bequeathed to those stars because, they're seen as surefire bets.
In 1975, Queen began recording their 4th album, A Night at the Opera. At the time, it would be the most expensive album ever made.
It was painstaking. We were using sort of 4 studios at once at one point, and there'd be a different member in each studio doing different things. Speeding and stopping the machines and slowing them down and speeding them up again and recording that. It seemed to take forever, actually.
For 4 months, the band overdubbed track after track.
We really did take it to, so the tape was, all the oxide was almost worn away. It was actually transparent in places.
The result was a sprawling, diverse album which indulged the band's influences from music hall to opera.
I see a little silhouette of a man. Scaramouche, Scaramouche, will you do the fandango?
We were sort of almost showing off what we could achieve in the studio.
Oh yeah, but making records in the 70s was a lot of fun. You usually own the studio, like you'd block book it. You would live in that studio for 2 months. You'd have ping pong tables, pool tables, dartboards.
The record company's role was simply to write the check.
So yeah, the idea of anyone going to a Queen album session and discussing the merits of the songs with Freddie Mercury and Brian was pretty unlikely. They knew what they were doing.
But investment in these headline artists didn't tell the whole mid-70s story. In 1973, Arab nations had declared an oil embargo, and the price of oil, a key substance in the manufacture of vinyl, had quadrupled.
There's a shortage of PVC vinyl, the oil offshoot that records are made from. The price has shot up £60 in 3 months to £210 a tonne.
With vinyl costs soaring, record companies turned to cheap solutions to balance the books.
best of albums and greatest hits compilations and cheapy chart compilations become a kind of mainstay of the record company's revenue stream.
When I was at EMI, we started doing 20 Golden Greats, which was an enormous income earner for EMI at a time when we struggled in the mid-70s. You paid no recording costs. You just basically compiled it and you made an ad. That kept the books balanced.
Best of albums by The Carpenters, The Stylistics and ABBA were the UK's highest sellers in 74, 75 and 76. And in the huge rock market, there was another way to package collections of hits cheaply: the live album.
It's better than a greatest hits because the greatest hits were kind of like for the part-timers or the non-serious fans, the here today, gone later today crowd. Live albums, though, had their cake and ate it all up. You had all the hits, but done in a new, unfamiliar style.
It was easy as pie to make a live album. You would just show up with a truck that had a 16-track recorder in it, set up the mics, or take a feed off the stage mics, and labels were thrilled that a live album took relatively nothing to produce, and you could still get millions of sales.
It was an LP recorded in 1975 that showed just what a cash cow the live album could be. British guitarist Peter Frampton had released 4 studio albums, none of which had even scratched the US top 20. For his first live album, he took to the stage at San Francisco's Winterland Arena.
It was 7,000 people, in Winterland, and when we walked out, got this huge ovation. And because of that, I think we forgot that we were recording, and the audience just brought something to the show, and we just did one hell of a show that night.
The recording of a live LP was the reverse of the often lengthy, complex sessions of a studio album.
I'm standing at the back of the control room, leaning up against the wall, and Ray he said, I'm not going to do a mix, I'm just going to put all the faders up. He said, check this out. And I don't remember what he played first. I just remember us all going, and just the energy that we'd captured from that. It was just quite special.
The mix of Frampton's best material, his rapport with the audience, and the instantly recognisable talk box was a smash hit.
I'm going to have to disinfect my iPhone now.
The album became the biggest selling record of 1976 in America and the biggest selling live rock album of all time.
You couldn't go in anyone's car, anyone's house, or walking down the street. You heard Comes Alive coming from somewhere, And even I would change the channel on the radio. Now I wish.
Live albums, best-of collections and bankable megastars kept the industry growing. But attitudes to risky new releases were changing.
The record companies after the oil crisis, in a sense, become more conservative in their choices. They become perhaps more business-like.
With most debut LPs failing to hit profit, labels cut back on new releases. And in America, album-oriented radio, which once championed the artistic freedom of the LP, was becoming increasingly resistant to new music.
Now, bigger, corporate companies have got hold of radio in America, and we're beginning to want certain tracks played from certain albums.
Radio had gone from playing every new song that the music industry put out to a very tight playlist. and no one in a competitive market wanted to be the first one to try out a new song. So increasingly, the universe of songs being played on the radio was shrinking.
Album-oriented radio was still key to breaking the vast US market, but in order to break the tightening playlists, new artists needed a new approach to creating a record. In the early 70s, Tom Scholz was an engineering graduate and wannabe rock star in search of a record deal.
I realized somewhere around 1973 or 74 that the only way I was going to get a chance to have my music heard was if I could find a way to get it on the radio.
Scholz built a studio in his basement where he set about creating songs that could break US radio.
From that point on, I was pretty much independent. I could play every single part, and I not only didn't need anybody else, I really had learned the hard way that the only way that I was going to be successful is if I did everything the way I heard it.
Scholz used his engineering know-how to produce a sophisticated, radio-friendly sound. This was no rough and ready demo. Every guitar note, every melody, every vocal was thoroughly produced.
More Than a Feeling is a sensational track. He was a brilliant, brilliant producer.
The vocals are panned a little bit towards the center to give more phasing on the line on purpose. If you listen very closely, you can tell that there's two singers singing the same part. Here there's 4 lead guitar parts come in. There's one on each side playing the same note, then there's a harmony part on top of it. There are 2 electric guitars, one on each side. There are 2 acoustic guitars on each side. As the lead guitars ring off under the vocals, there's a total of 8 guitars playing, plus the bass, of course.
Scholz's sound caught the ear of producer John Boylan.
I remember taking the 2-track tape and flying to New York with it and playing it at the singles meeting in New York for Ronald Luxemburg and the entire Epic staff, and they went nuts. And I knew that something was going to happen with this record right then and there.
Boylan persuaded Epic Records to sign Scholz and vocalist Brad Delp under the name Boston, and the debut album was released in the summer of 1976. A band was assembled to perform the music, and just weeks after More Than a Feeling was played on FM radio, Boston played their first gig.
I guess they could have accommodated something like 1,000 people in the stands. There was a riot. 3,000 people showed up. They broke down the fence. The promoter was arrested. It was the most exciting show of all time.
More Than a Feeling helped turn Boston's album into one of the biggest-selling debut albums in history. And not only that, it heralded a whole new style of rock music.
I would say Boston was the first album of a certain genre, and that genre was continued on by acts like Journey and Styx and Kansas and other artists that had a sonic signature, that sounded great on the radio, that were definitely rock, but also melodic and also had a lot of other things going for it than just a plain ahead rhythm and blues kind of rooted rock and roll.
The kind of music that was dominating American FM radio began to change. AOR was no longer album-oriented rock.
In the 70s, it did become adult-oriented rock, and there's I think a simple reason, is that the audience became adults. Let's face it, they weren't going to be teenagers and college kids forever. Album-oriented rock became adult-oriented rock only because the audience became adults.
Of course, the downside of groups like Foreigner, Journey, REO Speedwagon was that we now had the formula. We now had the rules, the map. We could build it in the laboratory. A little bit of Zepp, a little bit of Beatles, a little bit of this and that, and we could come up with this really beautiful anthem that'll sound perfect on FM radio in America. So a lot of these records are fantastically well crafted, but they're kind of sealed hermetically. There's no air in them, there's no life, they don't breathe.
Welcome to the Hotel California.
Polished melodic rock was becoming a feature of the American charts. In 1977, the Eagles' Hotel California was knocked off the #1 spot by the biggest selling album of the year, Fleetwood Mac's Rumours.
So an album like Rumours, for instance, manages to combine the kind of rhythmic, catchy element of kind of rock and roll with something that's slick and smooth.
Isn't the right thing to do.
Perhaps its audience were seeking something akin to easy listening. They wanted something that was comforting and could be stuck on in the background. But they are a generation that's grown up with rock and roll, so they're used to the idea of a beat. Everyone of a certain age probably has a copy of Rumours. It became part of the furniture of being an adult in the 1970s.
But it wasn't just the album buyer that was growing up. It was musicians too. The British prog artists, famous for pushing the envelope of the album in the early 70s, were now increasingly accused of indulgence.
I think progressive music started with every good intention, you know, and it started in the way we've been describing of you know, pushing out, let's experiment, let's see how far we can go, let's introduce lots of other different elements into it, you know. And I remember my turning point with all of this came watching Yes at Madison Square Garden, where there were pods lowered down through dry ice, you know, onto the stage, and the pod opened, and the drummer steps out, you know, through the dry ice, all to very sort of dramatic, you know, music going on, and I began to think, whoa, you know, hang on a minute, we have now come about as far away from Elvis being at the RCA studio in '56 as you could possibly get.
All those guys that were in their early 30s by, you know, the mid-70s, they were all pretty ropey, you know. It wasn't just the LP, it was the Rolling Stones too, you know, it wasn't just Pink Floyd, it was David Bowie too.
The promise of the long-playing album was no longer delivering for a new generation of music fans. But once again, the album was about to be reinvented.
Now it's extremely provocative, you know. Starts with, you know, what we can only assume are jackboots marching. At the time. At that point though, it's all over. Everything that's gone before that is now redeemed fucking irrelevant as soon as he starts anti-singing.
I don't want a holiday in the sun. I want to go to the New Bell Sun. I want to see some history.
In 1977, the Sex Pistols released their debut album, Never Mind the Bollocks.
Punk, in a sense, defined itself against hippie. Whatever hippies did, punks did the opposite. Hippies play long instrumental solos, punks play short solos or no solos at all. Hippies make conceptual thematic double albums, punks make short singles. It was designed specifically to be whatever the hippies didn't do.
It says around sound in a 2-inch wall.
We were quite Stalinish, you know, like breaking from the past, said it meant nothing to us apart from a few revered icons like the Velvet Underground or Iggy Pop.
Never Mind the Bollocks brought a new way of thinking to the LP. Short songs, no sleeve notes, and stripped down production.
Now this guitar riff, this is probably alone, it's just, you don't need much more of a reason to produce the Sex Pistols.
It's one of the first things you learn when you pick up the electric guitar, is that riff.
I wanted it to sound like, you know, real steel in there. You know, no flab at all.
Just two musicians played almost all the music on the record. Drummer Paul Cook and guitarist Steve Jones, who also played the bass parts.
He just played exactly the same thing on the bass guitar as he played on the guitar. You know, he just followed the root note, one octave down. You got a perfect harmonic sequence of bump an octave and then a fifth and an octave, and that's where the power came from.
And we don't care.
The more you look at it, it's got the word sex and bollocks on it, and it might be the most provocative piece of art, popular art, ever.
But despite its rebellious stance, Nevermind the Bollocks was no less sophisticated an album in its creative intent.
There's the politics and the fashion and the thinking, and youth culture had died before that point. It wasn't really, kids weren't empowered, they were just still seen as kids. The Sex Pistols came along saying that the established order was about to change, you know. It did, forever, you know, it's never gone back.
While punk purports to have kind of introduced a ground zero approach to everything that had come before, goodbye horrible, self-indulgent, concept album, progressive, long-haired fools. Nevermind the Bollocks actually turns out to be perhaps one of the greatest rock concept albums of all time.
Nevermind the Bollocks went to #1 in the UK in 1977.
That's it for them. That's all they ever did. That's their one statement to the world. You know, and imagine getting it so right once. I've made 10 albums, and in my own mind, they don't match up to that. And I'm an arrogant bastard. Seriously. And I'd give them all up to have written that. I truly would.
1977 also saw debut albums from the Stranglers, The Clash and The Damned. Even for this revolutionary, raw, anti-establishment music, the album was crucial.
Punk rock and new wave, which I think was, you know, the last great flowering of the LP, because everybody wanted their LP, even if they were like the Ramones. You know, even if they did, all their songs lasted for 2 minutes, you still had to get your album out, because you weren't a grown-up rock band unless you did that.
Punk and new wave had given the album a creative shot in the arm. In 1978, record sales propelled the industry to unprecedented revenues. And in a nod to the LP's early days, the biggest sellers in 1978 were both soundtracks. But the long-playing album was spinning on borrowed time.
The record industry is enjoying an unparalleled level of dominance and success in 1978. Sales of vinyl albums are at their peak. Then it's unfortunately followed in 1979 by a massive kind of global downturn.
In 1979, for the first time since album sales overtook singles 11 years earlier, record industry profits crashed by nearly a quarter. A golden age of album-led growth came to a close. The industry blamed a wider recession and new competition for young consumers' attentions.
They're concerned about the arrival of computer games, both in arcades and TV consoles. They're concerned about video recorders, and most of all, they're concerned about cassette recorders.
Changing technology was undermining the record industry's LP-oriented business model.
The cassette transforms the way in which people could listen to music. And they're no longer trapped by the physical object of the LP. They can also take the album, mix up the tracks, and make their own compilations. So it brings a completely different experience of listening into the equation of the album, one that reduces the album's kind of monolithic presence in kind of youth culture during that period and beyond.
As sales of LPs continued to struggle into the early 80s, a new way of selling music and a new canvas for artists' creativity was about to emerge. MTV was launched in 1981. Its brash, iconic branding signaled a new approach to selling music.
What made MTV so different is that everybody else who had done TV on, or music on TV, had tried to make music fit the TV form, create a story arc through it. And we said, no. We're going to make TV fit the music form. Mood, emotion, attitude. That was new, that was different, that was revolutionary at the time.
The music video changed the whole way music was marketed for a while. I mean, in the old days, you'd have to hear a song 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times, and then you say, oh, I gotta have this thing. But with the music video, because you had that extra level of entertainment, that visual thing, sometimes the conversion from experience to purchase happened a lot faster.
Within a year of its launch, MTV had made an indelible mark on the industry.
Clearly the most influential album was Thriller, Michael Jackson. He and Madonna were the first video artists that they really conceived of everything, the record around the video. They sort of thought of it as one piece.
All of a sudden, the emphasis was now making singles that would make a good video. People were writing for video, and we're abandoning the album concept.
The whole idea then of the video being the art form, and you're going to divert huge amounts of resource from your core album into the marketing of that album. You're going to suck half the budget away from what previously had been the recording costs into now marketing that album.
The era of the video had arrived. The long-playing album would never again be the driving force of the music industry. But even long after the needle lifted from its golden age, its influence lives on.
I consider myself extremely fortunate to have been in the music business in what I think will be looked back on as a golden era, and that is the vinyl era. I think was the most productive, the most musical, and the most forward-thinking era in the entire 140 years of the music industry.
Things like Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon, would never have been able to exist without the LP. And so there were beautiful albums produced that only would work in LP form.
It's like sitting by an old fire, a crackly piece of vinyl. There's something really comforting about it.
You could sit there over a lovely cup of tea and you could have people round to listen to it. It wasn't just this experience that happened in your ears only.
Every single time you listen to the record, you got to do the same thing. Handle it with care, put your finger in the middle, keep it balanced, put it on the platter, do that. You can't just casually throw it and hope that it's going. You got to do the same ritual, that preparatory ritual before you sit back and go,
That was like a gift to yourself or a gift to somebody else. And it was a magical experience.
And my favourite quote from any rock star is Ray Davies of the Kinks said that when he looks at someone's LP collection, he always feels like weeping because it's like looking into their soul. And anybody that collected LPs in that golden age can understand that. The record collection was really the art collection of the ordinary man, of the working man or woman, and it's only now as they slip into history that we see their real beauty and their real power.